Thank you, Fran. Morning, everybody, or evening if you're not in the UK. And well done if you've made it here from Canada. Pretty mad time zones, but it's a pleasure to be here. Wonders of modern technology. So I'm Anna Stodzer. I'm the course leader for our Masters in Sports Coaching and Sport and Exercise Science here at ARU. But before that, I did my Masters and my PhD at Loughborough University, where I met our esteemed ECR Keynote for the first time. So it's a pleasure to be here to introduce Rob, Dr. Robert Townsend, who also studied for his Masters and PhD with Professor Chris Cushion as one of his supervisors, and Professor Brett Smith as his other supervisor. Chris Cushion was also my supervisor, and in my mind that makes us PhD family. So Rob is effectively my brother, so that is why I've been asked to introduce him today. So like any normal family, you want to spread your wings and get as far away as possible after you've sort of finished your studying, or kind of just to get some distance between you and your siblings. So accordingly, after finishing his PhD, Rob moved to the other side of the world from the UK to take up his current post at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, where he's now a senior lecturer in sport coaching and pedagogy. Rob's research is interdisciplinary. It bridges qualitative research, social science and disability studies, and it's got specific focus on disability sport and sport coaching. Rob currently heads up the Disability, Sport and Active Recreation Research Group at the University of Waikato, which focuses on developing programmes of research in partnership with the disability sports sector, including organisations such as Paralympics New Zealand and Special Olympics New Zealand. His expertise in the area is recognised internationally, with recent talks given to Disability Rights UK as part of the Get Yourself Active campaign, as well as Welsh Rugby 2020's Inclusive Coaching Conference. He currently sits on an international advisory board for the International Council for Coaching Excellence related to coaching disability in sport, and he's provided consultancy to the European Paralympic Committee on Disability Coach Education, and also on the editorial board of the International Sport Coaching Journal. That's a lot of things. So I've learned a lot from reading and hearing about Rob's research, and he's got some great stories about his research and otherwise. And I'm looking forward to hearing about some of them today. And I admire Rob's research for a number of reasons, one of which being the strong sense of social justice. I think the thread kind of runs through that work. I think it challenges the status quo, which means it's worth hearing about today. If we're a PhD family, then this research community that we've got here could be thought of perhaps as a village or a town that we live in, within the wider landscape of academia and sport. So this, in my mind, makes Rob the first headliner on the introducing stage at the Village Festival. So please welcome research rockstar Dr. Rob Townsend.
Oh, geez, thank you, Anna. That's probably the best wrap I've ever had. So yeah, thank you very much. You've just taken about 10 minutes off my presentation, by the way. So thank you for doing that, so I don't have to say those things. I'm just going to share my screen, but in doing so, I think I will disappear. For many of you, I think that's probably a good thing. I'll try and be as expressive as possible, and hopefully this will hold your attention. Hopefully you can all see that. And so, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming today. Thank you for tuning in. I've already had a few complaints from a few friends saying that it's pretty early, and like Anna said, I would be astounded if there are any Canadians in the room, and I totally understand if there aren't. I just want to thank the QRSE organising committee for putting this together, and I think, to be honest, it looks an absolutely superb conference. So thanks in particular to Fran, Charlie and Patrick for thinking of me. I feel really fortunate and grateful to be part of this community, and kind of humbled to be speaking alongside some academics who are kind of my heroes as well. Yeah, and thanks Anna for that incredible introduction. Thank you so much. So for those of you who might be a bit late, my name is Rob Townsend, and I am a senior lecturer in sport coaching and pedagogy at the University of Waikato, which is in the North Island of New Zealand. Kia ora, everybody. This is my first academic position, and I moved here as a lecturer straight out of my PhD in 2018. Before I start on this presentation today, I'm really mindful that in the virtual room, we've got a heap of really talented and successful early career researchers, many of whom could and probably should be doing this instead of me. each with a wealth of valuable experiences and insights. And so despite a helpful and thank you to Charlie, pretty comprehensive brief from the committee, I really struggled with what to say here, because my intention is not to preach, police, or provide any kind of how-tos, as there's no blueprint for this kind of thing. And so I think what I want to do today is share some modest ideas for navigating your academic journeys by explaining a little of my journey and outlining some principles, 3 key principles that have helped me. For some, this might not be anything new, but I hope that my reflections can be useful as you think about and develop your research moving forwards. Okay, crack on. So to add a little bit of context and a little bit of background, as Anna said, my research primarily brings together the fields of disability, sport, and sports coaching. And I draw on qualitative methodologies and social theory to try and make sense of these areas. And my research in disability sport is profoundly influenced by my own experiences of being a disability sport coach and working across various disability sport contexts, working in community sport, in development sport, and through to performance sport. But I have to say that my entry into and my journey through coaching in disability sport has been fraught with anxiety, uncertainty, generally not knowing what I'm doing, and sometimes culminating in an unwillingness to engage with disabled athletes. It's also given me some of the most rewarding and valuable coaching and learning experiences that I've had. My involvement in disability sport peaked as a member of the coaching staff for the England Learning Disability Cricket Squad and as head coach of a disability talent development centre, which was based at Loughborough University and looked after athletes who had a variety of impairments, from autism, intellectual impairments, sensory impairments, and physical impairments. But if I reflect on my journey as a coach in disability sport, it suggests that, like many coaches in that area, initially I was thrown in at the deep end without much support and kind of left to bumble my way through, relying heavily on trial and error and without any real orienting frameworks to help guide my practice. For me, this wasn't ideal as a developmental trajectory as a coach, but importantly, it wasn't great for guaranteeing quality experiences for the athletes that I was working with. And so my research focus was born out of the fact that I never had any formal coach education in that area, and there had to be a better way to improve the experiences of disabled people in sport. Since moving to New Zealand and stepping full-time into research and teaching, I've stepped away from coaching, and my focus now is more on working with and supporting organisations that are responsible for coach development. And again, as Anna said, I head up a small disability sport research group here at the University of Waikato, researching issues that have been identified by various organisations in this area that are important to the disability sports sector. So while my work in disability sport and my research in disability sport originated in first-hand experience, it was through luck and serendipity, I'll touch on that a little bit later, that it morphed into a research agenda. And from the outset, my research into disability sport, and I guess like most PhD journeys, it was challenging. Coaching was an area that I thought I knew intimately, and that level of familiarity made it difficult for me to step back and, as good qualitative researchers do, make the familiar strange, to abstract my everyday interpersonal encounters and try and relay them in authentic ways to different audiences. And it was through dialogue with critical theory, and most notably ideas from critical disability studies, that I found an opportunity to do this. It was reading about models of disability and being exposed to some really basic ideas around the conceptual split between impairment and disability that was and continues to be a really important orienting framework for me. For example, recognizing the way that disability is located in the physical environments, built structures, individual attitudes, social restrictions, and cultural disadvantage, that was a game changer for me, not only as a researcher, but as a practitioner. I began to question my own experiences, questioning why I often felt unprepared, nervous, and anxious when I was asked to coach an athlete with an impairment. So it was working with these theoretical tools that I was able to locate disability in my own beliefs, my own knowledge, and my own skills as a coach. And some of the toughest reflections that I had were that in many instances, the only thing disabling the athlete in front of me was me. Now, for me, this was massive. And at the outset of my PhD, I wanted everyone in our field to share this. I wanted everyone in our field to share this level of reflection. And I felt that, to be honest, a lot of disability coaching research that was out there, disability was kind of taken for granted. It was seen as something that was fixed and inevitable, just another context to be explored. And therefore, that limited opportunities for change in the structure of sport. And so that led me on a research trajectory that since then I've looked at the construction of disability, specifically autism and learning disabilities in the field of coaching, elite disability coaching and coach education. I've also critiqued the way coaches reproduce and circulate messages about disability that are not always as empowering as we think they are. I think not only that, but engaging with disability studies and applying critical disability studies to coach education has been extremely productive. It's opened up opportunities for critique, which has enabled me to think about the way that coach education can reinforce stereotypes and assumptions about disability while claiming to do the opposite. It can perpetuate ableism while claiming to do the opposite, and it can endorse coaching approaches that locate disability firmly in the individual athlete, i.e. a medical model, rather than a social model. And at the same time, while disability studies have been really useful for me for providing critique, it also offers a powerful theoretical agenda for change. And I think that the potential impact is undeniable. And I've been working really closely with Dr. Tarbo Huntley at Liverpool John Moores, and we're now advising European Union policy on coach education, which is underpinned by ideas from critical disability studies. And a number of sports organisations are now rethinking their para-coach education provision based on our analysis. So who says that critical theory can't have impact? So this kind of leads me to my first lesson, really, and it's be brave. And for early career researchers, by this I mean be brave in your scholarship. For me, this means connecting with ideas from outside of our discipline, whether that's sports sociology, sports psychology, exercise psychology, whatever it is. You have an opportunity to use sport and exercise as a lens for raising issues that will be of relevance for researchers outside of our field, and to connect with broader debates around, for instance, the social sciences, psychology, and indeed broader debates in methodology. For example, the initial starting point of critical disability studies has led me now on a research path that draws from sociology, education, disability and labour studies, critical psychology, feminist approaches, policy analysis, and assistive technology. And I think the key thing is that as an early career researcher, often we're free from the pressure structures that bear down on our more senior colleagues. We're protected from the weight of admin, and we're in a situation where we have time and we have space to refine our ideas, to read, and to be brave. So we can push that methodological boat out. We can work with and against theory. We can be creative. Let's read Alison Kafer and Bruno Latour together. Let's challenge the absence of disability in Bourdieu's theory of practice. Or can we consider how the politics of disability mean we need to rethink conventional research practices? The possibilities, in my view, as an early career researcher, are endless. So I think that's a key thing for me. As a starting point, as an early career researcher, you have an opportunity to be brave. And I think that if you are brave, I think it's important to stick with your guns and know that you will be rewarded, but maybe not immediately. Okay, and you might have to brace yourself for a little bit of critique. It might be critique through peer review. Maybe your first paper will get shotgunned by 4 particularly unhappy reviewers who don't like that you had a pop at their research, understandably. But you take it on the chin, you refine your ideas, you make it better, and you go again. Eventually, when it gets published, maybe it will draw heavy criticism from a big name professor who dedicates an entire chapter to telling you why you're wrong. For me, publishing my first paper around connecting with models of disability was a really valuable exercise in creating dialogue in disability sport coaching. And I think as long as you're rigorous in your scholarship, you don't have anything to worry about. And I think provocative research should do exactly that. It should provoke. If anyone is interested in that chapter, by the way, it's chapter 2 in the Handbook of Disability and Sports Psychology. It's interesting. So brace yourself, be brave, but be brave still. And I think obviously reaching outside of our disciplines is a challenge, but I think it's one that is worth going for. I think it's also dependent on having supportive senior colleagues and mentors that can give you the time and the space to do this kind of work. But it means that we can give back and continue to build our field. And I think that you might be sitting there thinking, I don't know if I can do that. I certainly didn't think that I could do that. And my best piece of research and the paper that I'm most proud of wasn't actually supposed to be written. And it's not just the title that I'm proud of. This paper came from an inter-faculty seminar when I joined the University of Waikato, and I nervously talked my way through what I thought was a pretty handy Borgesian analysis of identity politics and power in elite disability sport. And it was pretty apparent after 20 minutes I'd bored everyone to tears. You know that moment when you ask if anyone's got any questions and it's completely silent. Hopefully today won't be like that. But eventually one of my colleagues piped up and asked me what it was like researching something that I was so close to. And I just told some stories about my experiences. I told some stories about what it was like working with that squad, what I saw that I was uncomfortable with, and some of my struggles to make sense of my field work and the role of theory in making sense of all that. And afterwards, two of my senior colleagues cornered me and they demanded that I try and publish these stories as a means of showcasing how to do reflexive ethnographic work, not just talking about ethnography, reflexivity and the need to be reflexive, but showing people how to do it, and that it might have relevance for broader debates in the social sciences. And so that was quite a nice challenge, you know, as an early career researcher, to be able to tap into debates from outside of our field around reflexivity, then land that in a mainstream qualitative journal. It represented a significant step in my development as a scholar. And then if I look across my subject in particular, you know, there are pockets of really excellent early career research work happening in the sociology of coaching, for instance. Charlie Corsby's work contributing to the sociology of work and how coaching can be a lens for understanding that. If I look at Anna Stotter's work, drawing heavily from professional learning and education and infusing that into debates and integrating that into coach education to try and drive the standard of coach education forward. I maintain that this paper from Veronica Allen is probably one of the best studies in disability sport coaching, fusing ideas from critical disability studies, sports psychology, and coaching. And Patrick Jakira's work, reflexive analyses of method and methodology in health and PE. And this is just a snapshot of some really great work that's happening, but it's where researchers are reaching outside of their discipline and drawing on those ideas to drive progress in our field. And so I think there's some really nice examples there. And this leads me to my second point, and highlighting the research that's going on in our community leads me to my point around relationships. I think it's really important as an early career researcher to develop and maintain an ecosystem that will enable you to survive and thrive as an academic. The first and most important relationship is with your supervisors. Now, these people have a responsibility for teaching you the game and ensuring you know what's needed to thrive in academia. And as Anna said, I consider myself extremely fortunate to have been supervised by Professor Chris Cushion and Professor Brett Smith, each with their own unique style and their own unique strengths. You know, I vividly remember sitting in the Starbucks at Loughborough University as Brett and Chris had a debate around social constructionism and critical realism, and I frantically scrambled to write it all down, you know, thinking I wish I was as clever as these two fellas. But then when I tried to be like Chris and Brett in my work, I remember the frustration receiving drafts of papers back from Brett with one line, what I thought was amazing, Brett telling me I don't understand any of this. I remember banging my head on my desk with frustration because the 11th draft of my PhD lit review wasn't up to Chris's standard. And I think both in their own way, they not only taught me how to write, which is obviously still an ongoing process, but how to be authentic in my work and to find my own academic voice. They also taught me how to be strategic when publishing. They taught me how to read the funding landscape. They taught me how to recognize the politics, the conflicts, and the interests that shape our intellectual space, how to tailor my CV to certain universities, whether they're teaching or research focused, and also the importance of quality work, taking time over your work rather than pumping out mediocre research. Not only that, from those two, I learned the importance of criticality, asking difficult questions through our research, as well as the value of connecting with others and trying to be rigorous in what we do. I feel really lucky to be working with them both. However, establishing productive relationships beyond your supervisor is fundamental to developing an independent research program. The PhD is a period of training to set you up for an independent program. So what distinguishes you from your supervisor? And I think a good way to think about this is, how can you be your supervisor plus one? How can you build on their strengths? How can you learn from their weaknesses And how can you make space for the next generation of researchers that actually look up to you? I think also another key set of relationships that you have are the people that you're surrounded with during your PhD. At Loughborough, I was really fortunate to share an office with some amazing early career researchers. We had Dr. Tony Williams, Dr. Sam Thrower, Dr. Anna Stotter, and Dr. Emma Richardson. You know, choose good people to work with, choose good people to throw ideas around with, whilst maintaining your own identity as a scholar. They'll make your ideas stronger. And connecting with these people, it isn't just about ensuring a steady stream of publications or bumping up your H-index. It's about developing your social capital, the networks of people and resources that you can draw on. Importantly, I don't think these connections have to be within your school. I was just lucky that I was in an ecosystem where there are lots of people in an office together throwing ideas around. Don't underestimate the power of serendipitous conversations over social media, at conferences, in your university coffee shops, pubs. You know, the paper on the right is an example of one serendipitous conversation. I think a second point that I also want to make around relationships is that it takes time. Relationships are crucial for generating impact for your research. And one of the biggest challenges I had has been trying to establish an independent research career fresh off the boat in New Zealand. You know, when I arrived here, I didn't know anybody. I felt really quite isolated. And it has taken time. And luckily, I've been given space to do that. But I've worked hard on forging relationships with lots of different groups at different levels. I think what was immediately apparent was, as a white, straight, European, able-bodied man, it quickly became obvious that traditional transactional or extractive approaches to research, they weren't going to fly here, particularly when it came to ethics applications, particularly when it came to grant funding applications, and anything around the intersection of disability and Māori communities. I think coming from the UK, although we're a multicultural society, the cultural politics of research are so different here. And with the legacy of colonialism, it's been imperative to try and flatten the power relations between researcher and researched. And so I've had to flip my approach. And I've based my approach to building relationships and doing research on participatory frameworks, namely co-production and the related practices of co-creation and co-design. And in drawing on these frameworks for conducting research, I've tried to ensure that my work upholds obligations towards the Treaty of Waitangi, ensuring autonomy and manakitanga, which is respect for Māori communities, and valuing participant involvement at all stages of the research design. I've got a really long way to go with this kind of stuff. It's not something that comes easy, but in practice, it has meant significant time spent consulting with key organisations like Sport New Zealand, Paralympics New Zealand, the Hallberg Foundation, Parafit Waikato, and doing so to outline key research priorities and involving these communities in the development of research questions. For instance, I've got an advisory board. Those photos on the right are from my athlete advisory board that are based with Special Olympics New Zealand. And not only have they challenged my ideas of what it means to be an effective coach in community sport and working with athletes with intellectual impairments, but they've also provided some incredible ideas for knowledge dissemination and translation. And also, they've fundamentally challenged my research practices, ones that unknowingly reproduced ableist ideas around informed consent and decision making.
Daddy, I've got a joke. Mm-hmm. Guess I should be.
That was cute. Now I'm building a team around me, and I think that one of the things that I'm really proud of, the way my PhD students are continuing that, and the way they've picked this up, and they too are working closely, if not embedded, within these kind of organizations. The problem with doing this kind of research, though, is the need to fund and support participant involvement in research, to truly value their time and to not be exploitive or extractive of their time. Now, in the short term, it might mean doing research for free and taking time to build trust and build relationships before you ask for any money. It also, for example, 18 months ago, Sport Waikato, which is a regional sports trust based in Hamilton, they asked me to evaluate the delivery of a coach development program. However, there was no money. I agreed to do that as a relationship builder. If we fast forward 18 months, after long hours spent observing courses, interviewing coaches, combing through data, due to COVID restructures, that report and that year's worth of data It's probably unlikely to see the light of day. But, excuse me, but we have a really good working relationship now. So I think one of the key messages when working with organizations is just take some time, figure out and be responsive to the needs of your community. But to sustain this research over time, ultimately, this is where grant funding is crucial. So I wanted to share a couple of lessons learned when it comes to grant funding. It's been a bit of a tale of woe, to be honest. So far I've applied for nearly $1 million worth of funding as a principal investigator from government-funded agencies over 3 years. There are two main research councils here in New Zealand. One is the Health Research Council and one is the Marsden Fund. How much have I brought in? 0. I think there's some reasons for this. I think my own keenness and my own enthusiasm coming off the boat, coupled with a not particularly subtle institutional pressure to bring in external funding, has meant that I've been quite quick to jump into funding applications without really taking the time to either build relationships with community partners, to build relationships with experienced and successful researchers, or take the time to align my research with government funding priorities. And so this has been quite a steep learning curve. And what I'm trying to achieve with my future funding applications is to start with the small parts, start with the incremental funding opportunities, and show that you can project manage, show that you can deliver outputs. And then when you do swing for the big ones, ensure that you build relationships and bring that wealth of knowledge into the application. This year, I'm not leading a funding application, but through visiting and building relationships with researchers from Massey University who've got a background and track record of securing grant funding. I'm part of a team with them now, swinging for both Marsden and Health Research Council grants. We're looking at enlightened ableism in sport and active recreation and how we can really challenge ableist attitudes from sport and physical activity professionals. So fingers crossed, we'll see what happens. But I think another lesson learned from that is going back to what I said earlier. Can you flip the focus of your research and use sport and exercise to connect with broader ideas and broader political priorities? In my experience, the Health Research Council, they don't give a toss about disability coach education, but they might be interested in how sport can be used as a health mechanism and how it reflects issues of equity, access, and the structured disadvantages that constitute disability. So yeah, not too many lessons from funding, just, I guess, keep swinging. And I think my final point, leading on from being brave and developing relationships, is that you should look to cultivate a level of serendipity. And by this, I mean create opportunities for you to position yourself in the best possible way to thrive on your journey, to capitalize on opportunities that come your way. And cultivating serendipity requires deliberate effort in being brave and putting yourself out there. It means saying yes to that guest lecture, which is 2 hours away. It means reaching out to peers, colleagues, and mentors to build your network. It also means being aware of the politics and the diplomacy required when building relationships. And for me, this was realized almost 2 years into my job here in New Zealand, where, again, fresh off the boat, I reached out to connect with researchers in sports coaching and the national sports organization responsible for coaching. And my emails were ignored. Fast forward a year and I'm at a conference in Tokyo. Actually, no, I was at a bar in Tokyo where I met a Kiwi academic, one of the ones who I'd reached out to, who explained to me that the relationships between academics and national sports organizations here in New Zealand were a little strained, with the policymakers feeling like they'd been burned a few times. And he explained that he and some other researchers were in the process of rebuilding trust and relationships with this organization, and that to do so, they needed to have good buggers around the table. And we needed to make sure that you were a good bastard. So I now sit on a national coaching research advisory board, and I've been able to forge productive working relationships with a national sports organization. I think it's important at this point to state that, I recognize and I feel really uncomfortable with the gendered aspects of that kind of discourse. And on our coaching advisory panel of 8, there's only 1 woman. But it's an example of cultivated serendipity, and you can't make change from outside. And I think that if I wasn't at that conference, and I think if I wasn't at that bar having a beer, I probably wouldn't have been seen as a good bastard. And finally, I think my final point is gaining access and entry to academia is not easy. The PhD is now a title of access, but it doesn't guarantee you entry. Consider how you are setting yourself apart. Are you putting yourself out there? Are you building a profile for yourself? Are you creating a narrative around you and your research? Are you reading policy and understanding the funding landscape? Do you have a publication plan with your supervisors? And do you have a plan for building relationships post-PhD, both with your studies, your peers, and also your communities? So final thoughts. I think we can get carried away with playing the game and kind of chasing that next progression, get the PhD, get a job, get promoted, get your salary reviewed. But I think, and this is something that Sam and I talked about this morning, Sam Thrower, stick to what you enjoy. When you put enthusiasm and when you put time into something, it builds success. So be brave, build relationships with your colleagues, with your peers, and with your communities, and try to cultivate serendipity. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I'd love to take some questions if there are any. Noho ora mai, stay well.
Thank you, Rob. I can see quite a few applause kind of emoji things. I'm going to add mine to that. That was really interesting, and it spurred a lot of reflection for a few of us listening, I think. So yeah, as Fran has put in the chat, if people have some questions, and please do pop them in, and we will compare them and send them on to you, Rob. We do have an apology from Brett for his scathing criticism of your work at in PhD times. So that's a bonus for this morning or this evening for you. I have a question to start us off. So you said a lot of very interesting things. One of the ones that I wanted to pick up on was when you were talking about unknowingly reproducing ableist assumptions in your research or in our research. So wondered if you could maybe give us some examples of some of those things that you've come across and maybe tell us how you've overcome them.
Yeah. Okay. So working with Special Olympics and having that athlete advisory board, it took me in a direction that I completely did not expect. So I started working with Special Olympics in order to try and build some disability-specific guidelines that we could give to coaches to enhance their knowledge around working with people with learning disabilities. What I didn't expect was to be challenged fundamentally on how I actually conduct research. And it's something really, really not necessarily innocuous, but I went to go and speak to one of my athlete advisors, and she was just about to start swimming training at a pool in Auckland. And I went and had a chat with her beforehand. And I gave her I prepared my participant information sheet. I got all the spiel and I got my tick list of informed consent. And I gave it to her and I said, if you could just sign that for me and then we can get going. And she looked a little bit puzzled around it all. And she's kind of hovering over the final thing. I give consent and I understand what's being expected of me. And she was like, I'm sorry, Robert, I don't understand what it is you want. And then it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Of course, this woman has an intellectual impairment, and I've loaded an informed consent form full of layered social meaning, complex words, and layers of decision making that often she wouldn't be expected to make on her own. So of course, she didn't understand. And so what we had to do, we had to dial it back and have a dialogue and have a chat about specifically what it was I was trying to achieve with my research. And that kind of started the cogs turning. And I remember revisiting my participant information sheet and my informed consent. And to me, it looked fine. Of course it did. I'm coming from an ableist perspective. So I took it to my athlete advisory group and I said, look, I need your help. We need to make this more accessible. We need to make this more versatile for the different groups that we're going to be working with. And we probably spent a morning designing some new ideas. And that involved flashcards, that involved statements that you can either agree or disagree with. It involved presentations with voice overlay. And it was really creative, and it just opened up my mind to new ways of trying to do accessible research. And I think that was the key thing for me. We often infer a level of decision-making capacity in our participants, but in in populations where, particularly from an institutional ethics perspective, that decision-making capacity may not be full, for lack of a better word. We need to rethink the way that we do research, and we need to do research with those groups rather than on them. And it was quite a confronting reflection for me.
Thank you. I think maybe that links a little bit to, we've got a question from Joe Blackwell saying, can you talk more about how you're managing the gap between researcher and researched? And I suppose that also, another thing in that same part of your presentation that I was interested in when you touched upon the legacy of colonialism. So do you have anything to add to that, where you're managing the gap between researcher and researched?
Yeah, I've got kind of, I think, 4 things that might be relevant here. I'll come back to the colonialism thing because that's something I'm still trying to work out, and something I don't think I've got right so far. In terms of minding the gap between researcher and research position, it comes back fundamentally to the politics of doing disability research, and rightly people potentially asking the question, what are you doing here and why are you doing research in disability communities? You know, I'm an able-bodied man. I've never experienced disability, and I think the key point there is I would never claim to know disability, either through my own embodied knowledge or through interviewing or representing other participants and their experiences of disability. I would never claim to know that. The second point would be methodological in terms of closing the gap between researcher and researched. We're now outlining research priorities with organisations and with disability communities. So we're looking at the questions that they're asking. And that also means that we, as researchers, are then accountable to those groups, which is something that Thomas Shakespeare, who is, he's a disability scholar, and he's talked about for many years. And we position those groups as experts. I'm not the expert here. I think that another key form another key thing to think about is reflexivity. You need to consider how you construct your scholarly gaze. You need to consider how you're working with these participants. And I think the final thing to think about there would be, I think it was 2010 or 2011, Jess Macbeth wrote a fantastic paper on doing disability research and the complexities of inside and outsider work in disability research. And she drew on Stone and Priestley's work around parasite or partner. Are you exploiting disability for your own gain, or are you a partner in raising awareness of oppression and exclusion? And I think it's always important as a researcher to be considering, am I doing this for me, or am I doing this for the community that I've engaged with and I'm working with? The colonialism thing, Anna, is really interesting, and it was something that I still don't fully understand, and it's something that I've really struggled with. Again, as a what they would call here a Pākehā researcher. So in New Zealand, we have an indigenous population. They have the Treaty of Waitangi, which ensures Māori autonomy and mana kitanga respect. And so in institutional ethics applications, we have to provide full justification for how your work is relevant for and intersects with and is respectful of Māori. And that's also the same for your grant funding applications, something called Vision Mataranga, and how your work is respectful and considerate of Māori. And it means, there's quite a heavy cultural toll on our Māori colleagues, because you get people like me knocking on your door saying, can you please help me? Like, what does this mean for my research? And I think my fundamental belief is that participatory action research shares lots of the central principles of doing Indigenous research and researching marginalised communities. And so that's fundamentally what my belief is, I think. But yeah, it's the whole understanding colonialism and the legacy of colonialism is still something that I'm trying to work on.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's lots of messages that are valuable for research in general there. And yeah, hopefully we can draw upon those in some of our own research. So there's a question again that links from Isabel Kennedy about whether you have any reflections on the academic landscape or culture difference, if there's any, between England, the UK and New Zealand.
There's less funding opportunity, fewer funding opportunities here in New Zealand. There are fewer unis, and therefore there are fewer people to connect with. That's what immediately struck me. It's also really clicky, and I think the story I told around connecting with researchers from different universities and trying to connect with the national sports organisation here. You need to be known, and whether or not that's the same in the UK. I didn't really spend enough time as an independent researcher in the UK to know that, but here it's been really apparent. You're 6 degrees of separation away from Richie McCaw. Everyone, it's a team of 5 million. Everyone knows everyone, but there is less money. I think that the academic landscape here is. I've definitely been protected for the last 2 years as an early career researcher. We've had a bit of a management change recently, and that's less so now. But there's still that subtle pressure for institutional administrative contributions. There's still that pressure for external funding. My next promotion is dependent on generating external funding, which, when there's only 2 research councils you can draw from, that's difficult. And I think you've also got to be really aware of how your research fits in with the priorities of the time. So I landed at a really, really opportune moment. So the government in 2019 released a disability plan, which was based on a review of the disability sports sector. They outlined quite a few barriers, quite a few issues across the sector, and they outlined an $8 million plan to sort the disability sector out. That was then followed by the recruitment of a disability consultant, whose job it is to enact a plan, and there's a certain amount of that is allocated towards research. And so, my efforts over the last 6 months have just been to try and connect with Sport New Zealand and say, look, we're doing the same things. Look at the research that we're doing here. We align with your plan. We align with your priorities. Can we partner in this? And so it's been opportune, but again, it comes back to that building relationships, and that's taken a lot of time just to build trust between us as a university and that organisation. I think I went off topic there, but I don't know if that will do.
That's okay. We've got a couple more questions that sort of link as well. That are more to do with being an ECR and kind of moving from PhD to academic posts. So Kay's asked, can you give a comment or suggestion for an ECR from developing countries like themselves to build a scholarship in qualitative research or sports psychology as a new field in that country?
This is a wonderful opportunity. So, you have a community of people right here who are either leading the way or are building new paths. And I think that, I'm absolutely not familiar with that kind of context, but I think that opportunities like this are absolutely massive. Please reach out to people who you find interesting. Please reach out to people whose work you share connections with, and see how you can connect with them. I think those kind of contexts have a lot to offer, particularly westernized journals in particular. We need to, things are not always, we know that developing countries are often underrepresented in lots of Western journals. And I think that you have a really good opportunity, not only to contribute to your context and your institution, but also to raise awareness internationally of what's going on in your subject. So yeah, use this opportunity. You've got some incredible scholars around you. Reach out.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were speaking, it's a shame we can't visit the bar to help cultivate serendipity at this conference, but there are some social opportunities planned for later on in the day. So do check the schedule. But also, I suppose, like asking questions and just sort of engaging with any Q&As is a good way to get out there and engage with this. So Richard also asked a sort of similar question about your experience of searching for employment post PhD. So did you have to sort of search for lots of different opportunities? And this would just be useful for current PhD researchers to know the realities and to prepare.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to tell the story that the reason I ended up in New Zealand was because I couldn't get a job in the UK. And so I did interview at a few places in the UK. I was offered one position, but it just was too far away geographically for a 2-day-a-week contract. I missed out on a job a good university with some colleagues that I would have liked to have worked with, because my CV was more tailored towards a research profile rather than a teaching focused university, and I missed out to an academic who had a really good teaching record. So my advice would be, as soon as you can start to smell the end of your PhD, start looking, because I think we're kind of limited in that we want academic jobs, but we also need academic jobs in our specialty. And so the further out you start looking, the more chance and the more opportunity you give yourself to find a job. And I was looking internationally from day one. You know, I'd been to New Zealand before to coach, and I had one eye on coming back. But I was looking at the States. I applied for probably 4 postdocs in Europe. One I actually heard back from 2 weeks ago, which was I obviously didn't get it. And so, yeah, it depends on your individual circumstances. You know, maybe you would be flexible to moving around. Maybe you're not. But, you know, consider what your circumstances are. Also, I'm not sure if it's Rich Simpson. I reckon badger Tony. See if she can get you some work at Leeds Beckett. Can you build your teaching profile? Can you get some research assistant work on other projects? You know, what areas of your CV are you lacking when you know that you need to hit teaching, research, and community? So, yeah, give yourself the best possible chance. So I know it's hard when you see the end of the PhD and you want to finish, but start looking.
Yeah, it's a hard balance to strike, isn't it? Because you want to obviously give your all to your PhD and make sure that you finish it off. I mean, I like that phrase of smelling the end of your PhD. I smelt mine a year too early, I think. So it's, yeah, getting a difficult balance to strike. So I guess sort of potentially the last question, in case unless anyone else comes up with any more, but a big hitter from Brett is asking if you could do one thing differently in your career, what would that be and why?
Crikey. I think I would have, and Brett will know this, because I think I would have fundamentally rethought some of the relationships I built during my PhD. You know, my PhD was partially funded by a charity in the UK, and the bridges that were built in terms of in doing that PhD, I wasn't aware of the need to be diplomatic and build relationships. And you know, some of the reports that I submitted were probably not salutogenic. They probably weren't strengths based when they probably could have been. And I think that the breakdown in relationships between myself and the organisation that was sponsoring the PhD initially, I would take full responsibility for that. And I think that some of the tone of my my reports that I would submit back to them needed to change. I would probably rewrite that first paper as well, the Models of Disability paper. I think many that I actually revisited in prepping for this talk. I revisited some of the comments that were made when the paper was rejected, and I think some of them stand fair. I stand by the arguments we made. I would probably rethink the tone of that paper, but then again, it's hard to say because it's taught me a few lessons around building relationships and being brave in your scholarship. So yeah, I think those are the 2 key things that stand out for me. I probably would still come to New Zealand, but it'd be nice to see the family at some point. So yeah, I don't know. Good question.
Yeah, and Brett's also put in the chat, for anyone that doesn't have the chat up, some good tips. So he said, sell yourself as having expertise in 2 themes, one on your discipline/focus, for example, sports coaching or sports psychology, and then the other on methods, because if you like teaching methods, and everyone needs methods for research. And sometimes you do see that in job adverts, sort of needing expertise in teaching qualitative methods as well, because I think everyone here, if you understand qualitative methods, then that kind of sets you apart from a lot of people in sport, particularly, especially understanding it enough to be able to teach it. So yeah. I
totally agree. You know, here at Waikato, I've taught across sport sociology, I've taught sport coaching, pedagogy, and also disability. So and also research methods. So yeah, be diverse, show off your strengths. A good tip I always used to do in interviews was I would screenshot the modules at the university that I was interviewing for. I would screenshot their papers that they would offer, their modules that they would offer. I'd say, I can teach that, I can teach that, I can teach that. often they'd have to, you'd have to justify that, but it tended to work because it would show how diverse you can be.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So I think we're pretty much, it's a good one to end on. It's a good sort of taking stock kind of question. So all that's I have to do is thank you very much, Rob. Yeah, it was great to hear your thoughts and experiences, and like I said, some good kind of messages for us all to think about and maybe take into our own research. So and just wait and see if Fran wants to signpost anything that's happening later on in the day, but I know it's kind of in the afternoon for us. But thank you for the great questions, and it was good to chat. So yeah, Fran has popped up, so I'll pass over to her.
I'm just going to say thank you, Rob. That was really, really interesting. And yes, I know you were worried that you didn't have enough or would have talked too quickly. It was amazing and really great timing, pacing. I was able to take notes and everything. Yes, like Anna said, we do have one more event. It's going to be tonight for the UK. So 6 p.m. we're going to have another In Conversation with Dr. Shona Burke. So you're all very welcome to join again. And literally, I have no idea what time it is going to be in other parts of the world. But Rob reminded me today that it was wrong in the New Zealand time difference program that I sent yesterday, because they are 1 day ahead. So it's going to actually be on the 8th of April for whoever is on the other side of the world. So just in case you were confused, my fault, apologies. And yes, thank you again, both Rob and Anna, for leading and chairing the session, and we'll see you later.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.